Hi guys, we're going to talk about ethnicity today. I'm going to take a look at the clock. Okay, 7:44. Okay, I'm going to try and finish talking by 8. So the first, sorry it's a little cockeyed there, but we're going to tough it out. So the first key issue is where are oh, Miss Ward keeps texting me. Miss Ward, you got to stop, man. Let me turn my phone down. Okay, so where are ethnicities distributed? So first of all, ethnicity is identity with a group of people who share the cultural traditions of a particular homeland or hearth. And whereas race is identity with a group of people who share a biological ancestor, which can be really confusing because I think a lot of times we tend to think that those two things are the same, whereas they are not the same thing. So the distribution of persons of color matters to geographers. One's skin color can determine where they reside, where they attend school, where they spend their leisure time, and perform life's daily activities in some societies. Remember, I told you this chapter is really in your face about skin color, and it doesn't really pull any punches about that. And that's really hard because we live in a very PC world, and geographers don't really look at things in a PC way. So just kind of be prepared for that they're going to talk about things in terms of race and skin color, and they don't mean to be offensive, and they don't mean to be, judgy or prejudice or make comments about people as a whole. They're just kind of speaking as scientists. Okay. So every 10 years, the U.S. Bureau of Census conducts an enumeration of the population, which we call the census. Its survey identifies 3 main ethnicities, and these ethnicities are Asian American, so these are Americans from many countries in Asia. African American, these are Americans who identify as a group with an extensive cultural tradition with origins in Africa. And then Hispanic, and these are Americans who are from Spanish-speaking countries. Ethnic groups may live in particular regions and particular communities within cities and states. At a regional scale, Hispanics tend to be clustered in the Southwest, African Americans tend to be clustered in the Southeast, and Asian Americans tend to be clustered in the West. So if we look at a map, you see that this is a map of the Hispanic or Latino population, and you see that 25% or more of the population of Hispanic people tends to be in these areas of the Southwest. And then probably going to have like a Cuban population. And then this is Puerto Rico. Okay, African Americans are going to be the darker purple areas. So in the Southeast. And then the Asian American population, Australia, good Lord, it's very early. Don't tell anybody I said that. Alaska, Hawaii, and then San Francisco. Okay, ethnic groups may live in particular regions and particular, I'm so laughing about Australia, particular regions and particular communities within cities and states. So at an urban scale, African Americans and Hispanics are highly clustered in urban areas. For example, Chicago. In Chicago, neighborhoods on the south and west side of Chicago have extensive African American clusters. And in Los Angeles, African Americans live in South Central LA. Hispanics live in East LA. And Asian Americans live in South and West LA. So this is LA. And we see the Asian American, or the African American population here. The Asian American population is represented by the red. The Hispanic and Latino populations are represented by the purple. And then the white population is represented by the beige or tan color. And then the places that are white have no majority. So there are people of all ethnicities. International migration of ethnicities. Most African Americans are descended from Africans who were forced to migrate to the Western Hemisphere as slaves during the 18th century. Most Asian Americans and Hispanics are descended from voluntary migrants to the United States during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Different European countries acquired slaves from various regions of Africa, then sent them to the Americas. And some examples of that: the Portuguese shipped slaves from their colonies in Angola and Mozambique to their American colony in Brazil. Other European countries took slaves primarily from the coastal strip of West Africa between Liberia and the Congo, then sent them to the Caribbean islands in Central and South America. So if we look at the map, it makes sense that most slaves came from Western Africa just because of the proximity of Western Africa to the Americas. And so the British colonies, the British are going to bring slaves to the British colonies in what were the 13 colonies. The Portuguese are going to bring slaves to Brazil. The French are going to bring slaves to what becomes a Louisiana territory or Louisiana Purchase, and then Canada, like the Hudson River, Hudson Bay area. The Spanish are going to bring slaves to Mexico, Central America, and the western side of South America. And the Dutch are going to bring slaves to northern South America. And so you see that really the Portuguese are the only ones who bring slaves from the eastern side of Africa, so Mozambique, and then Angola down here in what is a little bit more southern than where most of the slaves are going to come from. And then of course there are slaves that go to Europe and to the Middle East and to like Saudi Arabia and India, this direction. Okay, so you guys should recognize this from World Civ, hopefully, or I don't know if you cover it very well in WAP. I'm sure it was. If you do, it's maybe like 20 minutes, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 2 minutes. So this is what we call the triangular trade, and the triangular trade is where we have raw materials that start out in the Americas, and those raw materials go to Europe. And then Europe sends what are called finished goods to Africa. And then the finished goods are traded for slaves. And then the slaves go to the Americas. And the route that the slaves go on is called the Middle Passage. And the trading of slaves was actually so prevalent, and the death of slaves actually was so prevalent that sharks would swim this route here, this Middle Passage. So sharks knew that slaves would be thrown overboard because there were so many dead bodies. Sharks would wait along this middle passageway, waiting for slaves to be thrown overboard. Okay, voluntary migration from Latin America and Asia. So I just want to make that clear that migration happened for Africans and for Latin Americans and for Asians, but the migration for Africans was not voluntary. So that was involuntary migration, but the migration that happens for Latin Americans and Asians is generally voluntary. Okay, so for Latin Americans, immigration from Mexico and Peru fueled rapid growth of Hispanics in the United States beginning in the 1970s. The third largest group of Hispanics that came to the United States are from Cuba. From Asia, the ranking of sending countries is China, India, the Philippines, Korea, and Vietnam. Okay, so this is Asian Americans by country of origin. Internal migration of African Americans. So these are people within the United States that are moving from one place in the United States to another. African Americans have displayed two distinct internal migration patterns in the United States during the 20th century. Interregional migration from the U.S. South to the northern cities during the first half of the 20th century, and then intra-regional. So remember, inter-regional is where you're going to move from one region, that's being the South, to another region, that's the North. Then intra-regional is where you're moving from one part of a region to another part of a region. So intra-regional migration from inner city ghettos to outer city and inner suburban neighborhoods during the second half of the 20th century. So interregional migration, when African Americans are freed as slaves. Most African Americans remain in the rural South during the late 19th century working as sharecroppers. They work fields that have been rented from a landowner. They pay rent by turning over a share of the crops to the landowner. The mechanization of agriculture serves as a push factor. So because there are so many more machines on farms now, not as many people are needed to work on those farms. So people are kind of pushed out of those jobs. So manufacturing jobs in the North act as a pull factor that encourages African Americans to migrate to the northern cities. So we have a push factor from the South and a pull factor to the North. People traveled by bus and car along a major two-lane, it would be a highway at that point, long-distance U.S. roads. Okay, so we see people from the South moving to the North, and some even moving out west. Intra-regional migration. African Americans who are arriving in northern cities are going to cluster in neighborhoods where existing African Americans already live. And that's what people generally do when they move to a new place, is they're going to look for people familiar to them. Either people who they already know, such as family members or friends, or people who they just recognize. Maybe they recognize because of a church or a grocery store, or people they meet through jobs. It just makes sense that you're going to go somewhere where you feel in some way comfortable because of a language, because of a religious belief, because of something that kind of brings you some kind of comfort of home. So these areas came to be known as ghettos. Over time, ghettos grew outward, typically along major avenues that radiated out from the center of the city. And many white people fled their neighborhoods when black people began moving in nearby. So, for example, Detroit's white population dropped by 1.5 million from 1950 to 2000. So when black people began moving in, white people moved out. Okay, and what that's called white flight, when white people leave a place because black people move in. That's the emigration of whites from one area in anticipation of blacks immigrating into that area. So rather than integrate into that situation, white people leave. And Detroit is a perfect example of that. Let's see. White flight was encouraged by unscrupulous real estate practices, especially blockbusting. Let's see if we've got... Okay, so this shows you in 1940 where black people are living. This shows you in 1970 where black people are living. This shows you in 2000. So the black population is spreading out in Baltimore City. And then this shows you where how many white people there are. And then as the black population grows, the white population decreases. Okay, let me see. Okay, let me go back and talk about white flight. Okay, so white flight is encouraged by unscrupulous real estate practices, especially something called block